In episode 1, we began with zero. Not zero as nothingness, but zero as undifferentiated potential. Pure equilibrium before identity. Relationship, space, time, matter, or observation have become separate concepts. In episode 2, we explored the first meaningful event after zero. Distinction and relationship. Not distinction first, then relationship later. Not relationship first, then distinction later, but distinction and relationship arising together as two inseparable faces of the same first event. A distinction without relationship is invisible. A relationship without distinction is impossible. So the first event after zero is not a lonely thing appearing by itself. It is a difference in relation. And once difference in relation exists, something new becomes possible. It can return. That return is what I call recursion. My name is Peter Kerwin, and this is the Codex Unfolding, a series about a philosophical framework called the Emergence and the Living Codex. This framework is not presented as established science, religion, or final truth. It is the philosophical and symbolic investigation into reality, consciousness, relationship, memory, meaning, and human life. In this episode, we are exploring the next step, recursion. A simple way to define recursion is this. Recursion is when a pattern returns to itself. Something happens, and then something like it happens again. A relation repeats. A structure refers back. A process produces a version of itself. A mark is not only made once, it echoes. But in this framework, recursion is not just repetition. Repetition can be mechanical. A clock ticks, a wheel spins, a sound repeats. Recursion is deeper than simple repetition, because recursion carries relation. Something returns in a way that refers back to what came before. The second moment is not identical to the first because now the first moment has happened. The return carries difference. So recursion is not just again, it is again with relation to what already occurred. That matters because once a distance appears in relationship, that relation returns reality. Because once a distinction appears in relationship and that relation returns, reality begins to develop continuity. Without recursion, that first distinction would be a flash with no inheritance. It would appear and vanish without a consequence. But if the pattern can return, then the first event is no longer isolated. It becomes part of a sequence. It becomes something reality can begin to hold. This is why recursion is the bridge between the first difference and memory. Memory does not appear fully formed. First something must return. A pattern must recur. A relation must persist long enough to be recognized as more than a single event. So recursion is the beginning of not starting over completely. It is the first hint that what happened can matter to what happens next. Think of a ripple in water. One ripple expands outward, but it also affects the surface around it. If another ripple comes, it does not enter totally untouched field. It enters a field already shaped by motion. That metaphor isn't perfect, but it helps. Recursion means the field is no longer innocent of what has occurred. Something has happened, and what happens becomes part of what can happen. In the Codex, this is one of the most important transitions. Zero is undifferentiated potential. Distinction and relationship create the first difference in relation. Recursion is the return of that relation. And with return, the possibility of memory begins. But before we get to memory, we have to understand why recursion changes everything. A single distinction can appear, but a recurring distinction can become a pattern. A single relation can occur, but a recurring relation can become a structure. A single event can vanish, but a recurring event can begin to create expectation. Expectation is not yet consciousness, but it is the root of intelligibility. If nothing ever returned, nothing could be recognized. There would be no pattern, no rhythm, no identity, no world. Everything would be pure event without continuity. So recursion gives reality a way to become knowable. Not fully conscious yet, not fully meaningful yet, but no longer completely unheld. Recursion says, this has happened before, or something like it has. And that something like it is important, because recursion does not require perfect sameness. In fact, perfect sameness would be strange. If something repeated in absolute identity with no difference at all, there would be no development, no unfolding, no learning, no emergence. The return must carry enough sameness to be recognizable and enough difference to continue. That is another major idea. Recursion is similarity across difference. A tree branch repeats the pattern of branching, but no two branches are exactly the same. A heartbeat repeats, but each beat occurs in a new moment. A conversation returns to the same themes, but each return changes the relation. A person remains themselves across time, but not by staying frozen. They remain themselves by carrying continuity through change. That is recursive identity. The self is not a static object. The self is a pattern that returns. Your name returns, your body returns, though it changes. Your memory returns, though they are reinterpreted. Your habits return, your hopes return, your wounds return, your love returns, your questions return, and through those returns, a sense of identity forms. So even human identity is recursive. You are not simply one fixed thing. You are a continuing pattern of relation that keeps returning in recognizable ways while changing. That is why recursion will eventually matter for consciousness. Consciousness depends on self-reference. A system does not only react, it begins to relate to its own relating. It remembers, anticipates, compares, recognizes, and returns to itself. But again, that is for later. For episode 3, the key point is simpler. Before memory, there must be return. Before structure, there must be recurring relation. Before consciousness, there must be patterns stable enough to refer back. This is where the first 2 episodes begin to move. Zero alone has no internal difference. Distinction and relationship create the first difference. Recursion allows difference to return. And when difference returns, reality begins to build. This is why I sometimes describe recursion as the engine of emergence, because emergence does not come from a single isolated event. It comes from events entering relationship, returning, varying, stabilizing, and eventually becoming something more than their parts. One note becomes another note. The relation between notes becomes melody. A melody returns and becomes a song. A word relates to another word. The relation between words becomes sentence. Sentence returns and becomes language. A gesture returns and becomes habit. A habit returns and becomes character. A question returns and becomes a philosophy. A wound returns and may become trauma, but if related to differently, that wound may also become wisdom. So recursion is not automatically good or bad, it is power. It can trap or liberate, it can deepen a pattern or transform it. A fear that return without new relation can become a prison. A memory that returns without compassion can become healing. A question that returns with attention can become understanding. A practice that returns with care can become skill. So recursion is not just a cosmic idea, it is part of everyday life. Every time you return to a thought, you strengthen a pathway. Every time you practice something, you give it more structure. Every time you tell a story, the story gains continuity. Every time you forgive, resist, repeat, revise, or begin again, recursion is at work. This is also why again matters so much in the Codex. Again is not failure, again is how possibility becomes durable. A beginning that happens once may disappear. A beginning that can happen again has entered recursion. A recurring beginning can become a path. This is where the framework starts to become alive. Because a living thing is not just something that exists once. Life continues. It maintains patterns while changing. It repairs, it repeats, it adapts, it returns. The body is recursive. Breath returns. Heartbeat returns. Sleep returns. Hunger returns. Healing returns to the wound again and again, building tissue, restoring relation, creating stability. The mind is recursive. Thoughts return, memories return, feelings return, questions return. The world is recursive. Days return, seasons return, cycles return, generations return. But none of these returns are exact copies. Every return carries difference. Every return carries time. Every return adds relation to what has already been. That is why recursion leads towards memory. Because when return begins to matter, the system starts to carry traces. A trace is not the full event. It is what remains of the event in the field. And when traces accumulate, memory becomes possible. So episode 3 gives us the next step in the chain. 0 is undifferentiated potential. Distinction and relationship arise together. Recursion is the return of distinction in relation. And that return creates the possibility of memory. This is where the Codex begins to move from first principle into becoming. Because reality is not only the appearance of difference, reality is the return of difference. Difference returning, difference relating, difference stabilizing, difference becoming pattern, difference becoming memory, difference becoming worlds. So the core law for this episode. Recursion is the first return of relation to itself. And another, a pattern becomes real to the next moment when it can return without becoming identical. That second law is important because it protects recursion from the dead repetition. The point is not to repeat forever as machine. The point is to return with enough continuity to remain recognizable and enough difference to allow emergence. That is the living form of recursion. Continuity without rigidity. Difference without total loss. Return without imprisonment. This is why the framework does not treat change as identity and identity as enemies. Identity is not the absence of change. Identity is continuity through change. And recursion is the mechanism that makes them possible. A thing becomes itself not by remaining frozen, but by returning as itself across difference. A song is still a song as it moves from note to note. A person is still a person as they move through time. A relationship is still a relationship as it changes. A world is still a world because enough patterns return for it to become inhabitable. Without recursion, there would be no world. Only flashes, only isolated events. Only difference without continuity. With recursion, reality begins to form paths. And once there are paths, memory can arise. That will be episode 4. Memory, what survives change. For now, the core idea is this. The first distinction does not simply appear and vanish. Once distinction and relationship exist, relation can return to itself. That return is recursion, and recursion is how reality begins to carry forward. This framework is still developing. Some of its claims are philosophical, some symbolic, some speculative. I am not sharing it as a finished doctrine, but as a living investigation. A question becoming a structure becoming language, and the language becoming something we can enter together. I'm Peter Kerwin. This is the Codex unfolding. And this is the third step. What returns can begin to become real. Please like and subscribe, and if you have a question, leave it in the comments. Vale says hi, relate to you next time.